I've had the Klavis Quadigy envelope generator for a while now, but I've never really had a chance to explore it deeply and make a video on it. On the surface, it seems like a regular 4-envelope generator module, but it actually packs a lot of functionality in. Okay, let's do an overview of the module. It's broken down into the faders here, which allow you to control the various parameters, such as the envelope shape, the attack, decay. You've got these button controls here that let you access different submenus. This knob here allows you to move between the menus, and if you're in the menus, you're able to change certain parameters. You've got gate trigger inputs here to either trigger the individual envelopes or perform other functions that you can map internally. You've got 4 outputs here. These little LEDs illuminate to show you the value. You've also got 2 CV inputs, and you can CV modulate just about any parameter in the module, as well as this knob here, which you can map onto any other modulation. You can also send a clock in here and have clock synced LFOs or envelopes be generated. And you've got a global mode here that allows you to have macro control over envelopes using the sliders as performance controls. It's got a really powerful CV modulation matrix that you access using the CV matrix button and these other buttons, and I'll go through that later on. And because it's a digital module, you can save your favorite presets and load them back later on. Envelope generator has all of the standard things you'd expect in an ADSR envelope. You can set the decay, the attack, the release in milliseconds. I found it to be very, very accurate in my timing. You access each of the 4 envelopes by jumping between them using these buttons here. So obviously if I jump here to envelope 3, I now have to pick up the previous value for release before I can change it. And then when I jump back to envelope 1, I have to do the same. So the little arrows on the screen show you which direction to move the fader. Quadigy has a powerful envelope generator, so you can have a pre-delay. That's the amount of time before the envelope starts its attack phase after it gets a trigger. You have a hold, which allows you to hold for longer if you're in a trigger mode. We have a punch, which allows you to hold the attack phase as well. And then we have global timing, which allows you to scale all of the parameters of the envelope at the same time. You can also change the shape of the envelopes using these sliders, everything from right angles. So that gives you the ability to generate nice square waves, which we'll use as a clock generator. And you can also go logarithmic and exponential in between. And then you can adjust the output level from 0 to 100%. You have a choice of trigger or gate mode. Trigger generates a trigger and starts the attack decay instantaneous into the sustain phase, whereas gate mode will hold as long as the input is high. It will hold it in sustain, much like you're holding down a key. So we'll just leave it in trigger. Okay, let's do a little bit of patching. And so we're going to take the output here of this clock from Tempograph. We're going to trigger this envelope here on envelope generator 1. I'll take the output of that envelope. I'm going to patch it into the CB control of this first envelope here in Veils. As a VCA, we'll take as oscillator the output from Twin Waves here. Now, it has a built-in VCA, I know, but we will just leave it turned off because it makes it clearer to see for a demo. We'll take the output of this envelope and we'll patch it into the input of our Akari filter. And then the output of Akari just goes into the input here of the mixer on the KXA case. And then finally, I'm going to patch the volt per octave input here into the output sequencer 1 here. There's a quantizer built into the oscillators on Twin Waves. Fantastic oscillator. And so we don't have to worry about quantizing this to a scale. So let's take a listen to what we have. So nothing too exciting. Let's play around with the shape of the envelope. Now, if we make the edges of it much sharper, shall we say, you hear that more like on-off sound. And now we make it a more decaying sound. Let's increase the release time. Attack is 0, so it's very clicky. And now we bring it up. Okay, so we've got a basic ADSR envelope, nothing too exciting. Let's do a few other things. First of all, let's set up another envelope here and we'll modulate one of the parameters on Twin Waves to modulate the pulse width of the triangle wave. So we'll just take this output here from envelope 2. We'll send it into this parameter, turn up the attenuator on it. The pulse width there is in the center. Now let's take a listen to what it sounds like, because we're modulating, as you can hear, the pulse width on the envelope. There you can hear we're modulating the parameter on twin waves using a second envelope generated as soon as the first envelope's generated. Now, say I wanted to play around with that a little bit. Let's use that global time parameter we saw earlier to scale the envelope, either making it shorter, envelope 2, or longer. Now it's much more snappy. Now it's very long. And I can also patch this into tweakers here to offset and invert it. So if I bring it up here with the global time, I can shift it around above and below 0 volts. Well, that's very nice, but say I wanted to have that be an LFO. Let's now look at how we would set up an LFO that's free running, but also syncs to our clock. So we'll go into envelope 2, and we're going to go down into the cycle menu. Now, right now, cycle is off. And I'm going to change that to be individual. And that means the envelope will be its own free running cycling envelope, in other words, an LFO. And we look at how we could generate some LFO shapes that you might see commonly. So cycle mode needs a tempo. Now you can either do tap tempo or dial it in. So say I have a tempo here of 140 BPM. We leave the clock ratio at 1 for now and the filling at 100%. And gated cycle means if you send a gate in here that's high and this is turned on, it turns on the LFO and turn it off. So you can actually gate your LFO as well. Now you see we have a cycling envelope here, basically an LFO. We could now patch that in here to our parameter. Problem with that is it's out of sync with the main clock or main rhythm of our piece. So let's do something different. We'll go back to the cycle mode and we will go to external mode. Now, there's also global, and we'll talk about that a little later, but you can have a global clocking Quadigy that everything syncs to. But instead, I'm going to go to external mode, and I'm going to send it in an external clock. So let's patch the clock in here. Now clock ratio lets us set the division or multiplication of the main clock that this is going to cycle at. So let's see, here we are at 1. And here we're dividing it by 2, and you see that the LED is moving much slower. Divided by 4, we could scale up the global time. So it takes a little bit longer to run the envelope. And we can play around with these settings. You see, I have to move the slider to catch the previous value. And you might notice that when I move the sliders now, it's expressed as percentages, because that's the percentage of the clock cycle that is being occupied by that segment of the envelope. Previously it was in milliseconds, but if you're sending in an external clock, you can say, I want the first, say, 10% or 6% spent on the attack phase, but I want the bulk of the time spent on the release phase. And that lets you create different LFO shapes. Well, we saw a cycling LFO in the previous section, so let's take a look in more detail at how we can make LFOs and different LFO wave shapes with Quadigy. You can also use it to create square waves, which means you can build clocks, which means you can build rhythmic generation, and we'll look at that as well. I'm going to use my oscilloscope here. I have this lovely Siglent 1104 scope, which I've been using for a lot of different videos and testing things. And the yellow channel, we're just going to patch that to be the output here of envelope 2. And we're going to use envelope 2 as our looping LFO. Envelope 1, remember, is our voice articulation, so it's opening up the VCA. And we're going to use this LFO to do something on the filter. Maybe we're going to sweep the stereo or the mod parameters around. We'll have a play around with that. Now I'm going to patch in my oscilloscope. I have my lovely Siglent scope here, and I've got these patch adapters to BNC adapters from 3-tom modular. I'll include a link down below. They're very handy because they allow you to patch a signal from something and then they mult it so you can patch it into something else. And we'll just go ahead and patch it into, say, the mod input here on our Ikari filter, which will allow us to do a little bit of rhythmic modulation. I want to show you how to make different LFO waveforms and what the recipes are to make those waveforms. So in each case here, we're just going to be in individual cycle mode, which means the LFO is free running. We'll look a little bit later at clocked LFOs. and I have it on division by 4 ratio. So it's a reasonably slow LFO, so you can see it on the screen. Now, if we look on the screen of the oscilloscope, you can see the LFOs running. It doesn't, it just starts as soon as I have it configured. So there's no concept of it being turned on or off. If I wanted to have it come on when I send it a gate, I could set gated cycle mode to on, and now you see it is turned off. As you see, I have gated cycle turned on. There's no gate going in, so I'm going to go ahead and patch in the output of this precision voltage generator just to illustrate the point. So right now there's no LFO running, but once I turn this up to about 3 volts, it triggers the gate, and now the LFO will cycle. So this allows you to selectively turn on and off LFOs. We won't use it in this example, but I just wanted to show that to you. First thing I want to show you is how to generate a decay ramp. So it basically jumps to its max value and decays down. You want attack and decay at 0, set sustain to its maximum value, and we'll use the release parameter here to control how long the decay phase is. And now you see that we have a decay. Let's take a look at the wave shapes we're using here. It doesn't really matter what these guys are. If I set the release to be a very sharp, we'll get a much more spiky envelope, or if I set it almost exponential, we get an exponential decay curve. So we can patch this into our filter over here and see the effect it has. Correspondingly, if we want to have a ramp up, let's go back into our envelope generator menu. We set release to 0, decay to 0, and this time now the attack is the length of time it's going to take to ramp up. And we can of course change this to be, say, a linear envelope. If you want a sharp, if you want a linear slope, you just change it that way. And if you bring it down to this, you get just a little tiny pulse, which really doesn't do very much in this patch. So you see how the envelope shapes are being affected by as I adjust the time here. Well, if we can ramp up and ramp down, that means we can make a triangle wave. So let's do that next. Now we'll keep decay at 0, and the attack and release are going to have to be the same. So we'll set them at 50% each, as close as I can get it to 50% anyway. And these will be the time the envelope spends in each of those phases. So now we have a pretty close triangle wave there, probably because this wants to be nice and linear. You keep these nice and linear. If we adjust the shape of the segments using the second envelope generator menu, now you see we have this kind of almost like a wave-folded triangle wave. You hear the sound there as we reach that peak. And now we go back to the standard triangle wave. If we want that to go a bit faster, of course, we can go into the cycle menu, go down to the clock ratio and change it to, say, divide by 2. We could also patch this into, for example, the pulse width modulation here on the square wave generator in twin waves, and get a nice, interesting effect. And now you see what I mean about it being a very playable module. Once you have your kind of preset set up on it, you're able to come in and do different modifications or changes to it using just these sliders. And get a very different sound out of it as a result. So it actually is quite a playable module once you kind of understand what each of these menu pages are doing. Now let's look at what the pre-delay and punch parameters do. And that's these two menu items here on the envelope generator second page is pre-delay and punch. We'll stay with our looping almost triangle wave envelope, and we will start bringing the pre-delay up, and you'll notice that that delays the onset of the attack phase. And in this case, because we're looping, it's almost like it's flattening that initial ramp up. The same with the punch. The punch holds at the maximum value. And now we can get one of these kind of squared off triangle waves. So it's like we've cut the top and the bottom off the triangle wave. Now remember, this is still unipolar. It's not generating negative voltages. So if you need negative voltages, you either have to use like a tweakers or some sort of precision adder to add an offset to it. Let's just patch it into the volt per octave input here on a Quadigy and see what effect it has. I might just slow it down a little bit as well. Go to the cycle menu and set it to divide by 4. Change the oscillator type there to additive on twin waves. So we can get a kind of different output there from it. Now let's explore how the pre-delay function can affect the envelopes. And we'll use this patch that I've created to illustrate the point. We're taking advantage of the fact that the gates and triggers are normaled across the 4 envelopes. That means that a gate or trigger into gate trigger 1 here will get sent to all other inputs if you don't have anything patched in there. So I'm going to fire off 2 inputs to sound out the 2 voices on the twin waves. I'm using it as 2 separate oscillators into 2 separate channels on veils here for the VCA, and then into a Quadigy as a stereo filter, and then some delay added here at the end using the chrono blob. We'll just turn down the wet-dry mix on the delay so we don't actually get that in the mix initially, so we can hear what's going on. And just to keep time, I've also got a kick drum here coming out of Squid Sample. Now if we look at the oscilloscope, I'm going to start this playing, and we're just going to turn off the sound. I've got a kick drum going. There you hear the kick drum. And you can also see on the top trace, the yellow trace on the oscilloscope, is the master clock. So this is the trigger input going in here to trigger 1. You can also see the blue light flashing here on this halo cable from MyVolt. Both of the envelopes have a different shape, but they have the standard attack, decay, sustain, release setting, so there's nothing too unusual there. Let's then go on envelope 1, and we're going to go to the pre-delay, and we're going to watch the effect it has. And again, I'm going to bring up the sound now. And you're hearing both sounds at the same time. That's envelope 1 there on the left channel, and envelope 2, which is the right channel, and also the blue trace on the oscilloscope. So now we're hearing both at the same time, and you can look at the scope and see that the waveforms are lined up. If I just hit stop here, the waveforms line up with the clock edges as well. That's exactly what you expect. All right, let's start pre-delaying envelope 1. So now you hear the sound shifting, and you can see the envelope on the trace also shifting. We're at 300 milliseconds now, about 500 milliseconds. We've gone too far. The envelope is now too long. So now we've actually shifted it so it's on the offbeat, which is actually quite a nice effect. We could bring them back and do the same for envelope 2. Now, one thing I might want to do is take advantage of the global time parameter here to scale the envelopes. Let's experiment with envelope 1 and 2 now with the global time. So we go to envelope 1, and if we adjust the global time, we catch the value at 100%. And now you see I've scaled it up to about 300%. It doesn't take much to do that. You see the trace, the oscilloscope, the envelope's very smooth and drawn out now, like I'm stretching a piece of string. Add a bit of delay here for fun. And if I scale the envelope down, it's going to become a lot shorter. And here you hear the pluckiness of it as well there. You can do the same over at envelope 2. You have to catch the previous value. And now we're increasing. There's envelope 2 almost into a drone, and now into a much pluckier envelope. Now, if I wanted to edit both of those at the same time, say I wanted to scale both of the envelopes at the same time, I could go into each one and do it, or I can press both buttons at the same time, And now the two lights are on for envelopes 1 and 2. And now if I adjust this fader, I'm adjusting it for both. Now you see on the scope, and you hear on the music, we're back at 100%, now up to 200%, and back down again. So that's a really nice feature. If you have something that you want to play on both envelopes, you can adjust it that way. Say 2 out of the 4 envelopes. Another way you can do this is using the global control here. Now this opens up a global panel which allows you to scale the gate trigger value if you're in trigger mode, or if it's in clocked mode like you see for envelope here, a little metronome appears. So let's scale up, catch the value, and we can scale envelope 2 there, and envelope 1 independently. So it's a nice performance feature. And if it's at 100%, you get the exact value that you've defined in the envelope. Now let's look at a different way of synchronizing envelopes and also shifting envelopes around in time. And for that, we're going to change our envelope mode from a single cycle envelope, which is in other words triggered when you get a trigger here, to a clock synced envelope. So if we click on the cycle button, that brings us into the cycle menu where we're able to adjust different aspects of a clocked envelope or the cycling envelope. Now by default it's off, which means you have to send the gate trigger here to get your envelope. But if you turn it on, and in this case it's on individual mode, my envelope becomes an LFO, as you can see and hear on the screen and in your ears. Now, the Quadigy has a couple of different envelope modes. We've got individual mode, where every envelope can be on its own unique clock. So let's go over to envelope here, 2 here, set its cycle mode, and just turn down the volume a little on 2, because that's just a louder sound on the oscillator. It's now got its own individual envelope, and you see they're on slightly different clocks. Now you can tap tempo, but envelope 1's on 120 BPM, so is envelope 2. So we could change envelope 2 to be a bit faster, say 140. And off they go, sliding out of sync with each other. And we can bring it back into sync, of course. And they can go up to 300 BPM. Now they're back in sync. Now, of course, we can have clock ratios as well. So envelope 1 could be running at a double clock ratio. And that's the cycle length of the envelope is now double the BPM that you've set. Now these parameters up here still apply. We can adjust the global time to 100%, but if it exceeds the cycle length, it won't have any effect. Pre-delay, of course, will slide the envelope around, but again, has to fit within the cycle time. But now what's changed is these parameters, the attack, decay, sustain, release, are not in milliseconds anymore. They're now expressed in percentages of the overall cycle time, which of course is related to the tempo. So if I want to say my release cycle to take up 50% of the envelope, the decay takes up 0, that means the attack has to add up to the other amount to give 100% of the cycle. So now there's a 50-50 split between the two, and now I introduce about 25% of decay, and you can see the shape on the screen changing as well. Of course, we can slow it down, and so forth. Now, gated cycle means that if a gate comes in here, it'll cycle. If there's no gate, it won't cycle. So it's like a gated LFO. Okay, that's all very interesting for individual cycling mode. What about the next mode, which is global? So now the envelopes are running off a global internal clock. Let's move this cable out of the way here. And how do we set that clock? Well, if we now go down to our global mode, you'll see here that the icon has changed for the display for envelopes 1 and 2. It's now a metronome with the letter G beside it. And that means they are clocked envelopes running on a clock, and the G means they are global clock. Envelope 3 still has GT on it, which is the global timing. So it's an individual envelope that's triggered from a one-shot. So now envelope 1 and 2, if I adjust the slider, I'm adjusting the tempo changing it. You see it getting faster and slower there. So this is a great way of using Quadigy as, say, its own clock generating sequence. If you wanted to use Quadigy as a clock generator, you could do that. So let's set envelope 3. Let's go back up here to envelope 3. And we're going to set it to be, again, cycle mode global. And what we want envelope 3 to do is we just want it to be a clock. So I'm just going to set the sustain up. So instead of taking a clock from pounds, I can just patch in this here. We'll see it on the trace. Now envelope 3 is generating a clock there. It's just a little off the top of the screen. And we just bring that back in. We bring it back down so we can see. There we go. The yellow trace at the top of the oscilloscope. There's envelope 3. It's a square wave generator, and that means it's our clock. Okay. And now we have it synced to the global clock, so I can go in here and make it go much faster. You can see that. So envelope 3 could sequence my sequencer over here. Let's do that. And I could make it go faster. Of course, my delay is going to get a bit warped if I do that. We're going to use envelope 3 to trigger the kick drum, and I'm just going to mult using this MyVolts little mult here, which will allow me to mult this into the oscilloscope. So now you can see on the top trace the kick, and if I bring up, and we'll just unpatch these two guys here. If I bring up this, we'll hear the kick. We're just not going to use the oscillator for this particular patch example. Now I want envelope 1, which is the pink trace you see on the second line of the oscilloscope. I'm just going to patch that into this hat here. Now right now it's very much in time with the kick. So I go to envelope 1, set the global time to be 2. Now we have our hi-hat on the 8ths. Now envelope number 2 here, we're going into that. We'll have it on, maybe on a clap. Right now it's clapping a bit too much, so I'm going to scale it back to... Now one thing we can take advantage of is something called offset. And if we offset, we're able to shift. You hear it there, the clap is shifting there in 12ths around the clock cycle. So if I wanted to make my hi-hats, for example, or my clap go off beat by about a quarter measure, you'll hear it there. It's just ever so slightly off. Now it's off by a half, so it's not going to be... Okay, if we are able to do an internally clocked LFO or clock divider style patch, can we do it with an external clock? And the answer is yes. You might have noticed the word clock written under the CVB input here at the bottom of the module. This allows you to synchronize the clocks in Quadigy to an external clock. And in this case, we'll do that using pounds. So let's just patch. We have a pretty straightforward clock here on output 1 of pounds. I'm just going to patch that into input 1 there. So for each of the envelopes, I want to change their cycle mode from global to external. Now we know we could do it one by one, but if I press all 3 buttons at once and all 3 lights come on, I'm editing all 3 envelopes mode from global, press the button, to external. So they are now all externally clocked envelopes. You'll notice when we're in external cycle mode, we don't have any tempo settings. Now we just have a divisor of the master clock ratio. You saw that it took a few moments there for the actual kicks, drum sounds to start coming through. Why is that? Let me show you again. Watch. So it took a few moments because the Quadigy needed to get a couple of clock ticks in, about 3 or 4 clock ticks to synchronize the internal clock to figure out what exactly was the tempo of this clock. So that's why when I pressed play there, nothing happened, and then we got both the oscilloscope trace and also the sound you're hearing. Now if we go to the global mode, now we can see a very different and quite fun animated squiggly line icon, which now shows us the relative multiplier or divider of that envelope cycle from the master clock. And this allows us to have a lot of fun doing things like dividings. So it's divided by 2 there for the clap, for example. I can multiply it up. You have to be very gentle here. You can make ratchets on your hi-hats. Slow it right down. I can multiply it by 4. So all of a sudden, I've turned my envelope generator into a clock divider, which is actually quite playable using these faders, these global faders here. Now I want to show you how we can CV modulate different parameters on the Quadigy, because it has a very good mod matrix implementation. We have two CV inputs, CVA and CVB, and CVB doubles up as a clock input if you're using external envelope generation, which we're using for these triggers into the drums right now. We also have this knob here, the U knob or user knob, and this acts as a sort of a macro controller, allowing control of multiple envelope parameters at once. So I've set up a very simple patch based off our previous example. Again, we're using our clock divider example to divide our fast clock down into various triggers into the drums. And I have an envelope coming out of envelope 4 here, triggered as well from our master clock. You'll see it in the first trace on the oscilloscope in yellow. So there's our envelope that's triggering just a very simple voice here with the twin waves. Now what I want to do is I want to modulate, say, the attack and release of that envelope so it can humanize a bit or make it a bit more playable. So to do that, I press the CV matrix button, and this now allows me to select a CV source, one of these three here, and map it onto one of multiple CV destinations. So to select the source, I press the shift button, or the CV matrix button, if you will, and whether I want U, A, or B as my source. I'm going to choose U, and you see here we have this little flashing U on the display, showing that we're now mapping the U, in other words, the user knob, as the CV source. Now let's choose some destinations for that modulation. And I'm going to use the slider here now, and the slider changes behavior to become a CV modulation mapper from -100 to +100%. So we're going to add about, say, 50% or so to the attack, or sorry, release, and about maybe 9-10% onto the attack parameter. Now let's watch what happens when I turn this knob. You can see on the oscilloscope trace, and of course you can hear with your ears how the attack and release is being modulated. Now I might decide, you know what, that attack, I actually wanted to go shorter, so I could make the attack be modulated negative ever so slightly to just shorten it down. And again, we'll leave the release as is. Attack, long release, longer attack, shorter release by turning the knob. So you see the U button can become a macro control, and of course you could macro control it to different parameters across multiple envelopes. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, and that's sort of a manual macro control for modulation. What about if we want to use a CV input? So we want to use CVA here to humanize the attack and release on that envelope. And I'm going to just take the output of, say, sequencer number 2 over here, which I've randomized on mimetic digitalis, and I want to use that into CVA to humanize it or change the values randomly of the release and attack. So again, we press CV matrix to go into CV mapping mode. We select our source, which we press CV matrix and A to select the CVA source. And again, I'm going to map that to the release amount, say 40%, and just a little trim, say 10% or so, off the attack amount. And you notice there's a little bar jumping around here. That's the modulated value for the parameter. So for example, if I was to add a little bit of attack amount, we would see both the attack and release getting modulated. And we can adjust these, of course, if they're being modulated while we're playing them. And you see on the oscilloscope trace how the envelope shape is changing as the modulation randomizes in. You're not limited to just setting up one envelope. One of the nice things about Quadigy being a digital module is we have presets, and that way we're able to load and save multiple presets by pressing the preset button. Let's go into save mode and select a free slot. So I'm in save, I press the button, we jump down to, say, slot 9 here, and now save success. I have saved this wonderful preset we made for the video today into slot number 9. You also can CV load different presets, so you're able to go into preset and map different CV values to load in different presets. So it's actually quite handy, because what it means is for different parts of your performance, you could jump between different presets, or indeed you could have multiple variations of the same envelope settings and jump between them under CV control. One last thing I want to talk about is the difference between studio and live mode. Now, you might have thought to yourself, wow, with so many controls and faders, I'd be worried about knocking something when I'm playing live and ruining my presets. So to enter live mode, we press and hold global until the screen changes and a flashing S appears here, and the live LED lights up here. And now certain things are disabled and certain things are still enabled. So now, for example, we can still adjust the different parameters on an envelope as we're playing. But as you see, the cycle mode now is much, much simpler. The global mode is still present, so a lot of the values that we were able to change, we can't do anymore because we're just playing live. So it's a good way of, once you've got everything locked in, just simplifying the menu completely and making sure that you don't inadvertently bump something. If you do have a Quadigy and you're wondering why it's not behaving the way you think it should, and also following along the video and you don't see the same options, just make sure you're not in live mode. Just long press the global button to re-enter studio mode. Well, I hope you found today's video on the Quadigy useful. I tried to cover an awful lot. There's probably a lot more I could still cover. We could explore some of the more advanced modulation modes and timing modes. But ultimately, this gives you a great starting point for building your own patches and using Quadigy in your own setup. I've been pleasantly surprised with how many different ideas I was able to come up with in making this video. In fact, it actually took me so long to make the video because I kept playing around with even more ideas. And at a certain point, I had to just stop because I needed to get the video done. As always, I love hearing from people, so please do leave some questions or comments down below in the comment section if you have any suggestions for future videos, other modules you want me to cover, other things you want me to cover on, say, different modules I've already done, please let me know. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can stay up to date with the channel, and thank you for watching.